We're about a minute early, but almost everybody seems to be in the room, so let's get going again. Our next speaker is David Troy, an investigative journalist. The first line of David's bio is, Dave Troy is an investigative journalist focused on exposing threats to democracy, both nationally and internationally. And for obvious reasons, this talk seems particularly timely about how network effects have severed the US electorate. Most of us are from this part of the world, so I don't think that needs a whole lot of explanation, but these are international issues as well. So David, please, come on up.
Thank you so much. So thank you for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with all of you about this important set of topics. A little background on me. I'm a technology entrepreneur by trade. I started my first tech company when I was about 14, and I've been in the industry for like 40 years. So it gives you a little sense of how old I am. In the last several years, I've been pulled into the world of journalism, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background on how that happened. So about 15 years ago, actually around 2007, I started working with social media data. And I was among the very first people to really do that at scale. So I actually was the first developer to use the Twitter API back in 2007. And so I got to know the whole Twitter founding team and very plugged in with that world. And so what I started doing around 2012 or so was starting to make maps like this. Now, what this is a map of Baltimore, and it's not a geographic map, it's a social map of this city, from people that are connected to Baltimore on Twitter at the time. So what I was doing was basically looking at the connections between people in order to illustrate communities of interest. And so for those of you that are technically minded and know graph theory, the dots are nodes, and those are individual users, and the lines represent friend connections between them. The colors represent modularity class, which is a community detection algorithm, so you can basically find communities within these networks. And then, I've labeled some of the particular dots, including like the mayor and the Orioles and the Ravens, stuff like that. So what you find is that there are these communities of interest that form within these networks, and they're very visible, and they sort of perform the way you would think they would. Like sports ends up being a connector between, say, black folks and white folks. And you see that there's actually a great deal of segregation in a city like Baltimore, which you would expect. So very much, sort of whitish people on the right, more blackish people on the left. And that's a function of how this city is laid out. So when I started making these at scale, and I had to develop some interesting algorithms to try to get this data and to process it and think about it and stuff, it became clear to me that this was a really interesting way of looking at cities. So I also did similar maps for St. Louis and found similar kinds of patterns there. So you find that there's these communities of interest that emerge, and they very much similar to what you find in Baltimore. You kind of have startup-y, geeky people on the right, and more like black culture stuff over here. Some connections between them, but it's people sort of segregated into their own little buckets. And I was interested in both Baltimore and St. Louis, because I live in Baltimore, but also when I was doing this map of St. Louis, all the stuff going on with Michael Brown and Ferguson was happening at that time as well, and I thought it would be interesting to get some comparison between the two cities. So I also looked at things like who was following the Baltimore police and what sort of communities do they fall into. And you see some interesting things here where like people that are like super into police are at this opposite pole of, say, young black Baltimore residents, but they're all sort of interested in the police because they affect their lives, So this process of making these kinds of maps, really kind of lighted my interest in like how is American society structured, and led me to the idea that we don't pay a lot of attention to the topology of our society. We look at people and we think about their agency and their voting and convincing them to vote for one candidate or another, but we don't think about the structure. So this led me to think about the context. And again, going back to the talk from Kay yesterday about context, we all exist in social contexts. We are not individuals. We do not have individual agency entirely by ourselves. We exist within a community. And our communities shape us, and we shape our communities. So there's this constant dialogue that's going back and forth between ourselves and the communities in which we live. So if you think about this from a graph theory perspective, this is a set of nodes, and there are edges there as well. And of course, if you had a fully meshed graph here, you would have a lot of edges. And I want to sort of seed you with the idea that in any given social graph, there's way more information in the edges than there is in the nodes. And we mostly, as Americans analyzing society, throw away what we know about the edges and pay attention to the nodes. And that's a mistake. So we're going to get more into that. So I also want to talk to you about the idea of radicalization. And to think about radicalization, one thing that you can use as an abstraction is the idea of a cult. So imagine that you had a perfect cult. This would be my idea of a perfect cult, where every node is fully meshed with every other node, and there's a leader. Now, it doesn't have to be a leader in a cult. It could be a leaderless cult, people that just sort of self-radicalize off into their own corner of the world and start to take on their own beliefs. But what you kind of find is that it functions like a black hole. So essentially, there's sort of a notion of an event horizon, where once people sort of go beyond being connected to only their own in-group and not to any other group, they sort of start to fold in on themselves, and their interests, their belief systems become more concerned with the group belief systems than those of the broader society. So if you think of that as like an end state that maybe you don't want to end up in, think about what's happening to society in the context of information warfare. So we have this process of radicalization going on, which is essentially cult formation, where people are going off into their own corners and becoming radicalized, becoming less interested in societal interests and more interested in their own beliefs and their own worldview. And at some point, this event horizon thing kicks in, where you override your concern for, broader society and are more interested in what your in-group is caring about. So if you think about that as like an extreme case, the flat earthers. There's a really good documentary about the flat earth folks that you can find like on Netflix that shows that for the folks that believe in flat earth stuff, it's not so much that they believe in flat earth stuff, it's that there's a community of people that believes in flat earth stuff. And they get together and they have a good time and they have little conferences kind of like this, but less radicalized. You guys are much more normal than the flat earthers. Mostly, and so, this being kind of an extreme example, it's not about the belief, it's about the community and the belonging that people find when they get into these structures. So if you think about what people call disinformation and what it actually does, everybody kind of agrees that disinformation and misinformation are probably bad and they're doing bad things to our society, but there isn't much discussion of what the mechanism of action is. So I have been trying to kind of formalize a definition of how this stuff works to make our society dysfunctional. And what I would argue is that it tends to sever social ties. So where you may have a messy, complicated society with a lot of cross-cutting social ties, disinformation, misinformation tend to cause people to sever social connections between people and to, block people, disconnect, defriend people, all of that kind of stuff, and they get sort of hardened into their own groups. And then it induces this kind of excess social capital within these in-groups, which in turn can cause cognitive errors in group decision-making. And it turns the very idea of truth into kind of a personal subjective judgment rather than something that we could objectively agree on. And this is a function of how people work. We heard from Aaron this morning about the power of stories. And when people get together and tell stories to each other, like, the earth is flat, they can become extremely radicalized in those beliefs.
Excuse me, what do you mean when you say it induces excess social capital?
So the idea being that instead of having sort of like what you might consider a normal set of social relationships between people in a group, you have people that are like very, very tightly interested in themselves only. So the idea of like a fully meshed social network where everybody is connected with everybody else and nobody else, that's kind of what I'm getting at. So social capital is just a term that sociologists use to talk about the relationships between people and it's sort of like, if you think of it as a network edge, it's the properties of like the weight of that edge. So like if we're really good friends, we might have a high degree of social capital between us so that you would trust me a lot and I would trust you, or maybe you would do me a favor, that kind of thing.
Can you hit your microphone?
Yeah.
Sorry, so basically it creates more density in a smaller network.
Correct. Yeah, think of it again kind of like from that gravitational pull, black hole kind of aspect. It's like pulling people tighter in. So if you think about what a normal society might look like, I sort of made this as a counter to the black hole cult model, where you sort of have everybody sort of mixed up and there's a lot of connection and people are sort of messy. You can still detect some little communities and cliques there, but it's messy, right? Like what tends to happen with the injection of disinformation and information warfare into things is that you deplete the cross-cutting social connections while increasing the connections within the in-groups to the point where if this process is sort of allowed to continue to completion, you might end up with something like this. Now, the question that I would pose again is this structure conducive to democracy? And we'll come back to that in a bit. But yes?
If you're going to get to this later, that's fine. Is this my assumption is this is based on your view and research of social media data. I'm wondering how that plays out in the real world. Unfriending somebody in social media is different from unfriending my coworker and not interacting with the coworker.
Right.
You can have I could see these forming in the social media, but in the real world, I don't know what the political beliefs of everybody in this room is, and I quite frankly don't care. Right. But on social media, that could have a bigger difference of playing out in the real world.
Yeah, so you have to kind of take these as kind of abstractions of like, the idea that sure, these things can happen in social media. They're going to have some effect in the real world also, but it may not be exactly the same. What I've done is been working with a guy who's an expert on cults for the last 4 years. And basically, he affirms that this kind of process happens in the real world with cult formation. So, again, it's not a perfect analog, and whenever you're observing humans, you're not going to have totally perfect data on relationships and all of that. But the idea being that if this stuff is sort of happening psychographically within the social media context, it's probably happening in the real world too. And I think we know anecdotally that people talk about losing their cousins or their friends or their dads or whoever to radicalization of one kind or another. So take it with that grain of salt added.
I have another question about, you mentioned that the information, misinformation, disinformation in particular, can lead to this segregation. Is it a targeted disinformation? So do I need a specific set of disinformation for the green group and a distinct set of disinformation for the red group in order to get this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Effectively, what ends up happening is that the people who are benefiting from injecting disinformation into the ecosystem, they end up developing narratives and payloads that have these kinds of effects, and the ones that are effective, they amplify. Or they self-amplify through misinformation, through, organically. So the answer is that those things are all sort of in dialogue with each other. It is, once you have these groups separated out, it becomes relatively straightforward to figure out what the green guys are interested in and send them payloads that either cause them to do what you want or to divide them further, which is an even better goal for some of these guys.
Yeah.
Yes.
I agree that a lot of this is driven deliberately by disinformation, but I think there is also a process where we're pulled apart by the algorithms.
Oh, definitely.
Right?
Yeah, no, there's a
probably gonna
profit
get to
motive
this.
to some of this as well, and there's also people that I would consider to be conflict entrepreneurs who benefit by running these kinds of things and, building up audiences that cause them to make money.
Yeah, but even if we're just like looking at people who are on YouTube, you fall down rabbit holes because outrage is such a powerful
Absolutely.
hook.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
so you just get more and more outrageous content.
Yep, yeah,
in
no,
any
I think
direction
you have to
go.
look at this as like a complex of influences that are all causing these things to happen at once, one of which is misinformation and disinformation. Some of them are profit motives, some of them are algorithmic, which is ultimately kind of profit motive as well. So, in this context where we have this sort of fragile world that's dealing with these very complicated challenges of climate and, all sorts of political upheavals and whatnot, is this sort of division of our society helpful in actually solving any of these things? I'm not sure that we can solve something like climate if our society is so divided. So, people talk about solving the disinformation problem with like fact checking or browser extensions that give you context, and all of that kind of stuff can be helpful, but at the end of the day, what we're effectively doing is burning out our social capital across our society. And if you think of that as a forest fire, where we're basically burning down an entire forest, how do we then cause that to come back? You know, we just sprinkle a little truth on it, pour some water on this, and it's going to get better. We have to somehow or another arrest the depletion of the social capital that's happening, and we need to figure out some way to grow back the connections that could help us to have a more functional society and democracy. So this is what we're going to get into next. So, you know, people also talk about other countries like Finland and Estonia. We'll look at in a second. But you know, you think about Finland; they're developing curricula to help students detect and deal with disinformation. On the other hand, if you think about Finland, which has been living with Russia in its backyard its entire existence, and you have a culture that's not especially diverse, and you have people that are mostly living in fairly dense areas. Sure, you have some rural areas in Finland, but there's really no comparison between, say, Finland and the United States. Yes?
Just to make a point, both of my children go to school in Silver Spring, Maryland, in the public schools, Montgomery County, extremely diverse, and they received a similar sort of teaching through a class in middle school.
That's great.
It was a year-long class, so there is hope. So.
Yeah, no, and I think that kind of stuff can be good. I think the issue is how do you apply that at scale in some place like the United States where we can't agree on anything between urban and rural, and we'll get more into that. But, you know, effectively, you've got a fairly homogenous population, say in Finland, that has always had issues with Russia. Culturally, they have huge complaints with Russia for good reasons. And so, you know, the idea that we can just take and cut and paste a Finnish curriculum and sort of dump it into any random place in the United States and have it work is a little naive, I think. Probably, again, not a terrible thing to pursue where you can do it, but doing that at scale, I think, is an issue. And, you know, similarly in Estonia, you know, they're talking about how great, you know, they're doing at inoculating people against disinformation. But again, Estonia has been living with Russia forever, and their largest minority population is Russian. So, you know, this is an ongoing issue for these countries. It's not really the same as what we're dealing with here. Now, you know, when you think about the United States and our sort of electoral behavior and makeup of the country, you see maps like this and you think, good Lord, you know, it's a very Republican country. But in fact, we all know the story of how this works, and mostly this is empty land. We are a very big country that's mostly empty. And so, you know, the idea that, you know, this is somehow or another representative isn't really right. What's really right is something more like this. And the issue that I see when you look at this kind of setup is that, yeah, you know, actually the majority of the population is in blue places because that's where the density is. However, the way that we've structured the country and whatnot is that, you know, we end up with this kind of balance between large, low-density places and smaller, high-density places. And, you know, that's for a whole host of historical reasons we'll get into a little bit. But the interface between urban and rural is really where the action is. That's what people call the suburbs and all that, is where, you know, the rubber meets the road for deciding outcomes of American politics. And so back in 2012, I noticed that this kind of distribution, bimodal distribution, applied to the country. So effectively, voting behavior turns out to be a function of population density. Now, you have to, you know, sort of massage the data slightly. So the way that I massaged it was to group counties into buckets based on the doubling of population density. So as you double population density, you end up with this fairly linear curve. And in 2012, I determined that that pattern applied to the 2012 election, but then I went and back tested it against 2000, against 2004, against 2008, against 2012, 2016, and 2020. Now, what's interesting about this is you probably saw that the crossover point, which, you know, it's been a lot of people have remarked on this research, by the way. It started at around 1,000 people per square mile and has been kind of slowly inching down over the course of the last 20 years. To where it's Bloomberg, who made the same inquiry based on my research in 2020, put it at about 700 people per square mile. And so you probably heard that you know, the 2020 election was particularly dependent on what was going on in the suburbs.
Got to
Yes.
ask, correlation or causation?
I mean, it's a thing that's happening. We don't know that it's, causal in any way. Now, what I would say is that, people who are living in high-density urban environments generally have different, self-interests than folks that are living in rural environments do. So in general, people living in rural environments are more interested in gasoline and trucks, and people living in cities are more interested in public transit and public education and stuff like that. That's obviously a gross generalization, but if you take that as just kind of an axis that probably mostly exists, then a lot of other things fall out of that as well. And what we also find is that there's a lot of other factors that are correlated to urban and rural, everything from education to income, there's just a ton of factors that are also correlated with that particular axis. So the other thing we've seen happening, and this is a great visualization that was published a few years ago, this shows voting behavior in Congress. And what's been slowly happening is that we just basically have completely, lost track of any kind of cross voting behaviors within Congress. And you'll have to look at this exact paper to get, specifically what this is showing, because it's obviously there are probably some bills where, people are crossing over, but in general, we've seen these kind of two networks forming. And if you look now at most analysis of like Congress and sort of how they cluster, you'll see that these kinds of very clear divisions exist.
We're going forwards in time as we come from top to the
Yes,
bottom?
the up left is like 1949 and the lower right is 2011.
Okay.
It's a little hard to read on the graphic.
Could I
Yes.
So if you go back a slide and you look at the population density, other factors, you mentioned there are other factors that might be similar to this. Can you tell us what they are offhand?
Well, I mean, again, there's a ton of stuff that correlates with population density at this point. So there's a notion within sociology around sorting. So, you probably know like the book called The Big Sort from several years back, and Robert Putnam has done similar work showing how people are geographically sorting themselves. So what's happening is that we end up, like for example, if I know what kind of car you drive and what grocery store you shop at, I can tell you a lot of things about you politically, at least, and probably be right, So there's just, because of that sorting, there's all of these factors that now correlate. And I don't think that population density is necessarily the main, variable that you want to look at for that, but I think it's one that, it's a strong one, and it also defines the sorting in a really clear way,
So can I just ask,
Sure.
Do you know, or are you going to talk about the impact of remote working, like during COVID, and how that shifted demographics and
I don't have a lot to say about that, other than that we have been continuing to sort ourselves, which is probably continuing to drive some of this division. But yeah, I don't have specific stats on that. You hear a lot of people talking about, abolishing the Electoral College, and sort of what effects that might have, and whether that's a good thing or whatnot. I would argue that that gets at the very heart of this issue of the population density problem, because at the end of the day, the whole point of the Electoral College was to make it so that these large states that were mostly uninhabited and unpopulated would have some kind of relatively equal distribution to the smaller states that had a lot more power. Now, of course, slavery was another big driver of that as well. And you've got to look at all of that and sort of, how that came to be. But the issue is now, if you were to just eliminate the Electoral College, the complaints that people have about a few swing states controlling the outcomes of elections would be replaced by California and New York controlling the outcomes of elections, which then leads to the question of, would you see things like the secession of Texas, which is a real possibility, and it's something that is being actively pursued by Russia, trying to get a Texas nationalist movement going in Texas. And I will tell you that this is underway, and it has support from people very close to the network tied to Elon Musk and to RFK Jr. So I actually expect that we will start to see chatter of a real Texas secession movement sometime in the next year. And the idea that we're going to also break up, end the Electoral College would only accelerate something like that. So we need to be careful about what kind of glib proposals we put out there, because Russia will hop all over this, and when they're done with Texas, they're going to go after California. So in terms of, sort of radicalization and polarization within the country. This is from 2018, so it's a little bit old, but I think that the basic message still holds, that there's, these sort of wings on the far left and far right that are relatively small, and in the middle, everybody else just wants a functional government, the exhausted majority. And you see that happen again and again in Congress, where we come up with these situations where we have a government funding bill or the debt ceiling issue. And time again, 70% of the Congress votes for the reasonable thing that will make things work, right? Most people don't want these kinds of extreme outcomes. However, I would argue there's probably around 15% on both the left and the right, probably maybe a little more on the right, hard to say, that is sort of after a burn it all down kind of solution. And given the chance to have a minority sort of impact on outcomes, a minoritarian impact on outcomes, they may pursue that. And we have to be cognizant that these sort of things are in play. So really, two really good books on this topic are by Liliana Mason and Nathan Calmo, Uncivil Agreement and Radical American Partisanship. They're quick reads, and I would recommend everybody check them out. But what they've been finding is that 20% of people approve of political violence, at least in the general abstract sense, and that 25% approve of splitting the country in two. Now, I would add an asterisk to that that says that they might approve of political violence in an abstract sense if you ask them, do you approve of political violence? If you say, would you, personally condone the shooting of a presidential candidate, they would say, well, of course not. So the numbers are a little lower than I think that this lets on, but it's still, I think, a telling study, and they have just really good data and arguments in their book. This is one of the things that concerns me, and I wanted to make sure to bring up today. So what this is showing, it's from a paper called How Digital Media Drive Effective Polarization Through Partisan Sorting. And what this is showing is the product of a simulation that they ran, where effectively, if you see on the left, that's sort of people of different tribes from all around the world. And they're, each shape representing kind of a different tribe. What they simulated based on the data that they had was the interaction of people over distance over time. And what they found was that the further the distance was geographically apart, the more likely we were to end up with a totally bimodal distribution globally, where because of all of these cross-correlated factors that sort people into buckets, people basically start detecting which tribe are you. Oh, I see you drive a Prius, you're an evil guy, or you drive a Hummer, you're an evil guy, and so you end up through all of these signifiers ending up in basically two buckets, and that's it for the whole world. Now, if you think about what's happening in terms of authoritarianism around the world and sort of, people, being gravitationally pulled to some of that stuff, and then you also have democracies in the world trying to survive that, we're in a very precarious spot, potentially. Now, I don't think that this study is the end-all, be-all of this particular topic, but it's something we need to be really aware of, and it's something I think we need to be especially aware of when people say, oh, well, we just need to talk to each other. We need to make connections and interact and all this. And like, yes, maybe, yeah, if in person, that might work, but doing it over the internet and expecting good results just from interaction. In fact, the original dream of the internet was we would all be interconnected and talking and sharing, and some of that happened, but also this kind of stuff is happening. And so we need to be cognizant of the idea that, there's no just kind of like one magic, one-size-fits-all solution for getting us all to get along better. In fact, something like this could easily be driving us to be very much at war with each other over time, globally. So another couple of things on polarization and radicalization. You can see that, based on this study, which is from Edelman, they believe that the US and Argentina and Colombia and several other countries here are, now in the severely paralyzed or polarized category. And then you have a bunch of other countries that are probably moving in that direction, and some which maybe are resisting it. This up here in the upper right is from a book that General Michael Flynn put out about how to make people kill people, first through polarization, then tribalization, then dehumanization, and then doing the killing. This is another graph showing sort of the process of how QAnon tends to radicalize people, and it's effectively the same thing as what Flynn was talking about. So, these processes are happening in our society, and we need to, understand that they're real and figure out what to do about them.
So what did it say about Argentina? It was a little fuzzy.
Argentina is, it says the state of divisiveness in Argentina is commonly known as La Grieta or the Rift.
Okay, you could argue that a lot of that comes from extreme hyperinflation.
Sure, yeah, and I mean, that's sort of what Milei is trying to address now, although, his tactics are interesting.
So if you look at this chart, when you look at the less polarized and who's in it, does it, for those of us who live in the US, would we not want to stay in moderate and not end up
I think
less
that
polarized?
if you think about, Saudi Arabia and China and whatnot, I think we don't want to necessarily have totalitarianism, which is what you might think of when you think of the less polarized. So, I mean, take that with all of the context that comes with it. So this, to me, is a really interesting question. We talk about the greatest generation. And my question is, what made this generation the greatest? How did that happen? Did they just get born awesome? And then, like, Hitler came and they went and said, dude, we have to go deal with Hitler? Like, no, I think that there was something more at work. And I think that it has a lot to do with the fact that so many people from across the country, from diverse social backgrounds, were pulled into the war effort. And they were serving together across all sorts of social and other status lines and everything else, geographic, urban, rural. And that generation went off to war, they dealt with Hitler, and then they came back and they built the 20th century. And they were able to do that because they had had this experience and they also trusted each other. And to the extent that we have stopped doing that, now let's say we don't really want to have another world war, that would be maybe bad, but we stopped building social capital between people from different places, and we have no plan for doing that again. So if you think about, sort of what's happened to the military between World War II and the present, we have turned it into an all-volunteer force. Not to say that we should have a draft, but the people that are in it are oftentimes coming from very specific backgrounds, and it's a relatively small number of people. We've got around 3 million people serving in the military today, as opposed to the 16 million that served during the course of World War II, which only lasted 4 years. And right now we've also got 200,000 people serving in AmeriCorps annually, which is a pittance compared to any of this. It would take us 80 years to reach 16 million people. So, what I am thinking about is the idea that perhaps what we need to propose is some kind of national service type program where not necessarily military, but greatly expand something like AmeriCorps, but also rather than just sort of focusing on what the programs are, figure out how to do social mixing. Measure the success by the degree to which you mix people from different social backgrounds. And I think that we just aren't doing that. And if you think about what's happening in our colleges and universities are brand names. People are choosing them for brand and fashion type experiences because they want to go to an Ivy or whatever. And that's great, but how much mixing is really happening at these schools? How much, sort of complicating of our social fabric is actually taking place? And I would argue not that much.
Wait, how much mixing was happening post-World War II in the 40s and 50s?
I think less. But that generation was so spectacularly mixed by this experience that those are the people that went on to, form the institutions that shaped the rest of the 20th century. Now, I do think that, you've got Korea and Vietnam and, there's things like that where those kinds of things happen. But I would argue that since World War II, we just have had way less social mixing. And it's something we need to think about because at the end of the day, if you think back to the burned out forest fire analogy, how else are we going to grow back the social capital that we've burned away?
Well, I hear what you're saying, and I think everybody's nodding and smiling and saying, yeah, we agree. The challenge with World War II was it was an existential threat. So essentially
Sure.
The goal was, we got to go meet this.
Yep.
I would imagine the single biggest objection to doing a national service is there is no existential threat. I know you're saying it's an existential threat, but it's not. It's very abstract.
Well, people don't see it yet.
Well, and I would also say there's a certain amount of risk to just throwing a bunch of people together and saying,
please mix, because bad things can happen, which in the context of World War II is not so bad.
Sure.
In the context of some guy's, social experimentation might.
Sure, yeah.
So
No,
how would you answer that?
You're getting at a very good point there. First, which is that you got to figure out some way to design this in a way that gets buy-in and actually produces the outcomes you want. The other thing that you really kind of have to grapple with is the idea that what you're really talking about is social engineering. And you're talking about taking responsibility for collective social behavior. And at the end of the day, who has the moral authority to do that? Who is worth listening to? Now, Hitler forced this, but who else has the moral authority? Now, I will posit the downside case, which is that if we don't start to address this in some meaningful way, we will not be able to function as a democracy, because all of these other effects are going to disassemble our society. You had a question?
Yeah, or just a comment. I think it also needs to be said that this mixing that happened, that my own dad was part of, under the GI Bill, he was able to go to William and Mary from a small town in Maine, never would have gone there. But he was a white man. And so a lot of this mixing that you're talking about was primarily for white men.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think that were you to go back and redesign World War II to make it better, there's things you could do, But in terms of just a de facto experiment of a natural experiment of what actually happened, I would argue that, people felt like we had actually a functioning civic body back 50 years ago, and they kind of don't feel that way now. So you have to look at the things that's changed. I propose that this is maybe a thing that's changed.
But the greatest generation is also the generation that built Jim Crow.
They sustained it in some cases. I would say not so much built.
Well, okay, fair enough. But
yeah. They definitely helped sustain it in many cases. And again, I'm not, saying that they're the greatest ever. It's just we have to look at what might we do and what are the actual, issues here. We're being divided and have these kinds of issues. So I would argue that part of the issue that we're facing right now is that, we are not designing a world, and the people who are designing our world, the de facto world that we're living in, don't necessarily have good intentions at heart, or they even know what the intention should be. What are we aiming for? We don't even know half the time. We're letting people, with resources build up, great amounts of power without any clear intention. And, I think that this is the issue of how can we behave in a way that works. And I love that, this whole thing from William McDonough about design as the first signal of human intention. And I just think that we have not taken care to design a society that we actually, want to live in and can support our values. So again, how do we get more of this kind of complicated society that might actually sort of balance and actually function as a host for a democracy? And if you think about what's going on with democracy around the world right now, things are not looking great. Democracies everywhere are under fire. Now we've seen some modest victories for democratic outcomes, and this year it's been a very heavy year for democratic elections. But autocracies are doing pretty well, and we are on the brink here of flirting with various aspects of that here, and we need to give some real thought as to how this is going to go.
Sorry, what are those numbers?
These numbers are how they're rating different types of regimes.
Oh,
So
it's just a rating.
full democracies.
It's not-
So what they're putting the U.S. right now as a flawed democracy, or as a hybrid regime, I guess. So it's an interesting. They made some kind of metric, and then they pulled together scores. So you can read on that on the source for that. But this raises another question that I've been having, which is, how do we actually transition to a functional future for democracy? What's our forward-looking vision for democracy globally? And this is a really interesting little story that most people don't know about. This guy, Clarence Streit, was a correspondent for the New York Times covering the League of Nations in Geneva in the 20s. And what he saw was the League of Nations being completely dysfunctional. And of course, the whole purpose of the League of Nations was to prevent war and to, create peace and all of this. And so what he did was he wrote this book called Union Now, which came out in 1939. And have a quick listen to what his intentions were for this.
What we are trying to do is to unite the people of the North Atlantic democracies who are now in a coalition. We're trying to unite them on the same principles that we followed in our early history when we united the 13 states in our present federal government.
So this is a really kind of out there idea for people today, but this idea got a huge amount of traction in 1939 and was the basis for a world federalist movement. Now, his particular vision of it was as a union of democracies, not so much a world government. But the point being that we have stopped talking about how to evolve our democratic future in any meaningful way. We have a dysfunctional United Nations. We have individual democracies that are under attack. And we don't really have a positive vision for what a democratic world future could be. What we have instead is a bunch of authoritarians who are putting forth their vision about what the future could be. And a lot of people are saying, sounds pretty good. We have no counterproposal, and I would argue that we need one. So to sum up, I would say that democracy is basically software. If you think about the Constitution as, a layer of software, the society on which the democracy runs is the platform. And if you don't have, a PC with at least this much RAM and a CD-ROM drive or whatever, you can't run the democracy software. It just won't work. And what we're dealing with right now is a degradation of the platform, of our societal platform, to the point where the software won't run. And so I would argue we need to address that societal issue to heal enough of the divisions in our society so that we can actually function as a democracy and not be this dysfunctional, cultish, kind of mob that we're devolving into. And, chart a course forward that's exciting for democracy. And we aren't doing that right now. So that's what I would argue we need to do. And if you'd like to read, I've written a white paper, which is a work in progress on this topic, disinformation and its effects on social capital networks. You can scan that QR code, and you can also find me at davetroy.com. And my email address is davetroy@gmail.com. Any final questions?
Yeah, can I get one? So I not only believe everything you said, but have studied it and looked at it. But what's interesting is there are a couple of interesting counterexamples. And at the moment, they're mostly in science, or at least I know about them because of all the science. So the ITAR project, or ITAR as it's pronounced in France, has 7 primary sponsors and 27 sub-sponsor countries. This is to build the world's first really big, full-scale test of fusion power.
Right.
The 7 countries include the US, Russia, China, countries that in the geopolitical space are at war, and in secular space. The second example I would give you is the global telescope array going into South Africa. I forget his name. Again, a lot of countries that would not cooperate. So we've been having a lot of discussions on campus with some of us who are trying to think about this of why is it that these guys can cooperate in this scientific sphere when they can't in the political sphere?
Well, it's an interesting question. I do know that, recently, I guess Russia just pulled out of CERN, and I think they've also pulled out of this, International Space Station too. So, yeah, we'll see how that goes, I guess. But anyway, we need to get serious about talking about a vision for the future.
I'm really sorry. There's at least 4 questions here.
And I know you've got to move on.
It's got to come out of your time. That's okay? All right. So if we could take, is this Ike or Pradeep? Or neither one of you? Okay. Then Jennifer and then Nancy. Thanks.
Have you considered overlaying the role of fear in your evaluation? Because when I think about your example of World War II, the only thing that allowed us to overcome our fear of our differences was the fear of total annihilation in the form of Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And it wasn't until that moment when our fear of the external threat was very tangible and real that it tipped the balance and brought us together to face that united enemy, right?
Sure. Yeah, no, I've definitely thought about that. You see similar kinds of things with like 9/11. And I think people are starting to get pretty freaked out about what's going on with our democracy. Like, I think people are thinking that, ooh, things really seem to be on the edge. So I think one of the things we need to do is to start to socialize what solutions to this might be, because so far the only solutions that people really have are like, let's cut and paste the curriculum from Finland, which is nice, but that isn't going to get us there. We need to think more long-term about this. So that's why I wanted to socialize these ideas with you guys, and if you guys have, input on this, that's what I'm trying to collect, is anybody that's thinking about this stuff, I want to get it all in one place. So.
Well, Jennifer just has a suggestion that we need an alien invasion.
Well,
I'm sorry.
Reagan and Gorbachev joked about that in like 1987. Don't discount that idea as a disinformation operation too, because I think we may see some of that.
Okay, two more.
Yep.
Nancy and then Pradeep.
About your white paper, somebody's mentioned that the QR code isn't working. However, that is in the pre-conference readings that's available in Dave's section of community.
Yeah, I'm not
You
sure
go on
why
him as a
the
speaker.
QR code wouldn't work. Maybe it expired or something weird like
Yeah.
that. But
Anyhow,
anybody that wants to
everybody
either
has
contact Nancy or me, and I'll make sure you got it.
Yeah, it's in community if you just go in there and check it out.
There you go. Cool.
One more on your
Yep.
right.
So, have we ever been as united or as non-divisive as the data shows? Because going back to the revolution, right, what was it? 55% of the country that wanted to secede from England and the others didn't. I feel like we've always been this divided. It's just now there is, I guess, more diversity of thought in the Congress.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of unpleasantness between 1861 and 65 also, So we've and this is part of the issue of being a very large country that doesn't have a lot of people living in it. And so, I think you're right that these kinds of division have always plagued us. And the question is, like, how do we keep the devil down in the hole, basically? Because if we let it go unattended, we will end up with these same kinds of outcomes like we saw, before, so.
Well, thank you for your invitation for input.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure we could fill another couple of hours of conversation around that, but really interesting.